Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. It was a time of great political strife. It was a time of war, a time of a pandemic, a time of extreme anti-immigrant sentiment, and a time of vigilantism. And it was also a time that my guest today argues was an extreme threat to American democracy. My guest is Adam Hochschild. Adam Hochschild is the author of the new book called American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. Adam Hochschild, it is a great pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
Well, thank you, Mitch. It's always fun talking with you.
American Midnight focuses on the Great War years. We say Great War, meaning World War I. And it's fascinating because in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson, well, he is president during this time. In 1916, he runs for re-election on a platform of keeping the United States out of the war, but he would end up being the person most principal for getting the United States into the war. He does this on April 2nd, 1917, an address to a joint session of Congress when he called for a declaration of war against Germany. Of course, we don't have recordings of this speech like we would in later years, but it's a very dramatic moment, and it's a moment that you detail in your book. Can you talk to me about this day, April 2nd, 1917, and this address to a joint session of Congress?
Sure. I've always wanted to begin a book with a long chapter that focuses on a single day, because I've seen a few other historians do it, and of course it's one of the oldest storytelling devices there is. James Joyce stretched out a single day to 800 pages or so in Ulysses. But this was a key day, April 2nd, 1917. And because the focus that day is on President Woodrow Wilson, you know everything the president was doing minute by minute through the day, because his widow wrote a book, his doctor wrote a book, his chief of staff wrote a book, everybody around him, recorded it. And here's why it was so crucial. Up until that point, the United States had not been part of the First World War. This terrible war, the worst that history had yet seen, had been going on in Europe for almost 3 years. The U.S. had been selling munitions and making a great deal of profit to selling munitions to the Allies, but it hadn't been part of the war. The time came when Wilson wanted to join that struggle. And he went to Congress on April 2nd and asked Congress to declare war. And as the day goes on during this first chapter of mine, you can see the tensions on both sides. The streets of Washington were filled with, on the one side, pacifists who were hoping desperately that the U.S. would stay out of this tremendous slaughterhouse that was going on in Europe. And at the same time, fervent super patriots waving flags, demanding that we go off and fight. And how could we possibly want to miss being in the largest war that the world had ever seen? So Wilson goes to Congress, and it's an evening session. It's the first time ever, I think, that diplomats in formal dress, long morning coats, cutaways, were present in the audience. Members of the Supreme Court were there. Members of both houses of Congress assembled in the House of Representatives chamber. All sorts of distinguished guests up in the visitors' galleries. And with Wilson's family was a young man who was very adept at wrangling himself a seat with the presidential delegation on occasions like this, Franklin D. Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So Wilson gave this speech before Congress, and he was a great orator with a golden voice. The thing that struck me is that the moment it became clear that he was calling for a full declaration of war and for the United States to raise an enormous army and to send it to Europe, it was like it took the cork out of a bottle of boiling super patriotism that was just looking for a target for joy. There was one point in his speech where it suddenly became clear he was not asking just that the United States join the war and start sinking German submarines. People thought he might limit his request to Congress to that, but he actually wanted to raise an army of hundreds of thousands of men and send it to Europe. At that moment, leading the cheering was the Chief Justice of the United States, who leapt to his feet, Edward White of Louisiana, literally weeping tears of joy, leading this thunderous ovation at the prospect that the United States was going to join this incredible slaughterhouse going on in Europe. Now, why should the Chief Justice, who was incidentally a veteran of the Confederate Army, why should he be weeping tears of joy at this great prospect? I'm not sure, but it was typical of the kind of frenzy that spread throughout the country. There was this sense that, it had been unfair that the United States hadn't been able to take part in this great war that had been going on so long. And the first reflections of this frenzy was that anybody or anything with a connection to Germany immediately got condemned. Many states passed laws against speaking German in public all over the country. There were bonfires of German books removed from schools and libraries. People with German names changed them. That was when the Frankfurter became the hot dog. The hamburger became, I think, Salisbury steak. Other names got changed.
It reminds me of freedom fries.
Yeah, it's exactly. Same thing happened, almost 100 years later. So there is this potential for super patriotism, mindless super patriotism that is always hovering there under the surface in this country. And I find it particularly striking at this moment, 1917, because the United States had not been attacked. It was not like Pearl Harbor 25 years later. It was not like, the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. Germany had not attacked the United States. German submarines had sunk some American ships, but these were ships carrying munitions to the Allies, transiting war zones in the ocean, which the Germans had warned any ship carrying munitions going through this area is going to be sunk. So the U.S. really didn't have a valid grievance against Germany, but still there was that desire to be at war with somebody that was so manifest on that particular day.
Woodrow Wilson famously said that a main reason for this war, United States getting involved in the war, is that, quote, the world must be made safe for democracy. Was democracy an issue in this war in Europe? Now, your argument that the threat was here at home, but yeah. What's going on in Europe?
Well, people always want to feel that they're fighting for something noble. And so this statement of Wilson's in that speech, the world must be made safe for democracy, got a tremendous response. But when you look at things carefully, it really was not so. After all, one of the principal allies, Britain and France, yes, were more or less democratic countries. Germany, a little bit less so. The Kaiser had more power, but there was still an elected German Reichstag that had some powers. But one of the principal allies was Tsarist Russia, which was the last absolute monarchy in Europe. Now, of course, after Wilson, when Wilson made his declaration of war on April 2nd, 1917, his request for Congress to declare war, one advantage he had was that the first phase of the Russian Revolution, the overthrow of the Tsar, had just happened. That made it a little easier to claim that the world was now being made safe for democracy because the new provisional government in Russia had promised to have elections. But I don't think that's what the war was really about.
Is that what Wilson meant, though? Was he referring to this first Russia and the first provisional government, and the prospects of democracy?
No, but I think the fact that this had just happened, that the Tsar had been forced to abdicate just a couple of weeks before his speech, made it a little easier for him to say that. But he'd been building towards this moment for several months.
I always remember the first time I saw the movie Reds, starring Warren Beatty as John Reed, who wrote the book 10 Days That Shook the World, about his observations of the Russian Revolution. And I remember in the movie, this is the first time I heard this argument, John Reed, through Warren Beatty, the actor, making the argument that the war was for financial reasons. And that was the first time I had ever heard that. I was younger then when I saw that movie. But that was the first time I ever heard that argument. You lay out this argument about the financial aspects and motivations in getting into the war.
I think it's really true. One thing that had happened just shortly before Wilson gave that speech was that the American ambassador in London had cabled Washington saying, Britain and France are running out of money to pay us. They were buying a huge proportion of their military supplies in the US. Britain, I believe, was spending something like 40% of its military budget in the United States because American factories were turning out artillery shells, guns, submarine parts that were then assembled into submarines in Canada, all kinds of other things, and huge quantities of raw material, steel, explosives, and everything else were being manufactured here. But Britain and France had been at war for nearly 3 years. They had lost vast numbers of men. Parts of France had been turned into a wasteland. And the American ambassador in London warned Wilson and his cabinet that they're running out of money. And the only way they're going to survive is if we can advance them loans and credits. And this, it was felt, was hard to do unless the United States was actually in the war. So I think there was a strong financial reason for the United States to join the war, which was that Americans who had bought British, French, and Russian war bonds thought they might not be paid back unless the Allies won the war. Companies that were trying to collect debts for war supplies they had sold to Britain and France also were afraid they wouldn't be paid back. But with the U.S. in the war, then all kinds of credits and loans could be advanced to the Allied countries. And of course, the people who bought the Tsarist war bonds never were paid back.
If Britain and France would have lost the war, what would that have meant financially for the United States?
I think it would have meant that a lot of people wouldn't have gotten their money back. It would have been a serious problem. Although, of course, during those first 3 years of war, 1914 through mid-1917, American companies had made huge amounts of money from the war. In fact, the beginning of the war in 1914 really rescued the U.S. economy from the depression it was going into that was so severe that the New York Stock Exchange had closed down for a couple of months.
Your research into the documents and the archives, is there evidence that this was a principle? I mean, obviously we could see it, and people even back in the day could see it, and we'll talk more about that. But did you ever find anything in the archives showing that this was a principled motivation for getting into the war?
I think it is so generally acknowledged by scholars that I think very few people would debate that was a principal motive. And this telegram from the ambassador in London is one of the prime examples of that.
Again, Woodrow Wilson gives this address to a joint session of Congress on April 2nd, 1917, asking for a declaration of war against Germany. This is 6 months since he won his re-election bid, in which he ran on a platform to stay out of the war. Can you talk to me about the debate that would ensue afterwards, after this address in 1917 to Congress, the debate in Congress over this declaration of war, and principally tell me about Republican Senator Robert La Follette?
Well, one of the notable things about this period was that there was a sizable proportion of the American population that did not want to go to war. for a mixture of motives. Some people were of German descent and felt some loyalty to Germany. Um, the left as a whole, the 6% of the American population who had voted for Eugene Debs for president in the popular vote in 1912, and many people in other groups felt, this was a war between capitalist powers, and the workers of the world should be fighting the capitalists and not each other. And other people as well, not necessarily on the left, felt, this was a quarrel among rival European empires, and the US should stay out of it. When things came to a vote, should the United States declare war, 6 members of the Senate, which was then 96 people, because we didn't yet have Hawaii and Alaska as states. 6 members of the Senate voted no, and 50 members of the House of Representatives voted no. In the Senate, the most outspoken person was Robert La Follette, Republican of Wisconsin. One of the curious things about this period is that the divide between right and left on the war and on many other issues as well cut across party lines. So those 6 senators and 50 representatives came from both parties. Robert La Follette was the leader of the progressive forces in the Senate, Republican from Wisconsin, a very good guy who had fought all his life for the rights of labor, of minorities, of women, fought to regulate big business. He was not a socialist, but he believed that the power of big business ought to be restrained and highly regulated. He was in favor of all kinds of social welfare legislation. And he knew that the United States going to war would set back all of these causes tremendously. He spoke about this very eloquently, watching one after another of his fellow senators leave the floor as he did so. People began sending him nooses in the mail. He was hanged in effigy on the campus of the University of Wisconsin, his alma mater. All but 2 of that university's faculty signed a statement condemning him. He was kicked out of a club he belonged to in Madison, Wisconsin, the state's capital. And he really had a rough time. The Senate actually opened an investigation into whether he should be expelled from that body entirely. It was an extremely rough time for him, as it was for many anti-war dissidents. Incidentally, by a couple of years after the war was over, popular feeling in this country changed, and millions of people realized it had been a mistake to join that war, and La Follette was reelected.
I mean, I've known of Robert La Follette. We've talked about him on this radio program, also known as Fighting Bob La Follette, founder of the Progressive magazine. Of course, Adam Hochschild, you were a co-founder of Mother Jones magazine. But the fallout immediately after he opposed the war was interesting. I had never read about that before until I ran into your book.
Yeah, it's amazing how much a war unleashes nastiness in a country that goes to battle, because people start looking for traitors everywhere. And there was this thing that we talked about the persecution of anybody speaking German. I heard about this growing up, actually, because my father was 25 years old in 1917. And his father was a Jewish immigrant from Germany, and they spoke German at home, but they were, of course, terrified to do so on the street. And my father desperately tried to get into the army to prove his patriotism. He had bad eyesight. They wouldn't let him in, but finally he went to work as a civilian for the War Department and felt that gained him and the family some measure of protection. So that was sort of the first expression of the nastiness of super patriotism. And you can see photographs of, these bonfires of German books around the country. Then what happened, of course, later that year, in November 1917, came the second phase of the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks, the most militant faction, seized power in Petrograd. And then the fervor, the madness in this country turned from an anti-German thing to more of an anti-red thing, because many people in the government and in big business were afraid that, the Russian Revolution was going to spread to the United States.
You're right that this period of time is on a quote on a scale never seen before. The American military would now be spying on American civilians.
Yeah, this happened as soon as the war began. There was a guy who's one of the characters in the book. I like to tell a story like this through focusing on 8 or 10 characters in a particular period. And some of them are obvious people that everybody knows. Woodrow Wilson, who was president, Theodore Roosevelt, who was no longer president, but certainly wanted to be and was desperate to find a role for himself in the war. Other people are less known, one of them being an Army officer named Ralph Van Diemen, then a lieutenant colonel. Van Diemen was an intelligence officer who had honed his skills of surveillance by monitoring rebels in the Philippines, where the U.S. had fought a very brutal war from 1899 into the early 1900s against Filipinos wanting independence from American rule. And Van Diemen had developed a card file system to keep track of Filipino subversives. And as soon as the U.S. went to war in 1917, he went to the Secretary of War and said, "We need to watch subversives in this country." And he got the go-ahead to start a military intelligence division inside the War Department, which had nothing to do with watching the Germans. They figured the British and French were way ahead of them on that score in Europe, but rather watching subversive forces in the United States. So they were spying on labor unionists, they were spying on Wobblies, the members of the Industrial Workers of the World, they were spying on socialists, they were spying on Christian pacifists. And of course, one of the enjoyable things about writing about all this 100 years later is that you can see their records. They're in the National Archives, which have been back again in the news recently. And you can see the reports that Van Diemen's spies sent him from these different organizations. And it was a huge operation. Within a year, he had more than 1,000 people working for him, military and civilian, all of them spying on pacifists and left-wingers of one sort or another inside the United States.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Adam Hochschild. Adam Hochschild is the author of the new book, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. It is what we are in conversation about. Tell me about Leo Wendell.
Okay, he's one of my favorite characters in the book. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, big industrial town, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, the country's most militant labor union, were eager to organize. And in 1917, a new Wobbly arrived in Pittsburgh, and he was quite quickly elected secretary of the local Wobbly branch. And for the next 3 years, he led marches and demonstrations. He fired up his comrades with patriotic speeches. He loyally joined every conceivable left-wing organization in town. He was on the strike committee for a big strike of steelworkers. He supported the Socialist Party. He was active in the Radical Library, and always urging the most militant course of action. And the entire time, he was the star undercover agent of the Department of Justice, specifically the Bureau of Investigation, which added federal to its name some years later. And again, thanks to the National Archives, you can see the reports that Leo Wendell made, sometimes on almost a daily basis, of the doings of the left in Pittsburgh. Fascinating guy. Joyfully reported his successful attempts to cause divisions in various groups. And he played this role to the hilt For example, at one point, there was a strike of streetcar drivers and ticket takers in Pittsburgh. And to break it, the authorities brought in strike breakers, streetcar drivers from New York and Philadelphia. And Wendell led a couple of Wobblies into attacking a streetcar driven by strikebreakers and proudly reported to the Bureau of Investigation that they had beaten the driver and the ticket taker unconscious with a metal bar, the kind of bar that you use to adjust switches on a track. So obviously, the Justice Department had told him to go in there and cause violence, which could then be blamed on the radicals. So, I always wonder, what's the motivation of somebody like that? And I don't really know. Wendell is long dead, so I can't interview him. In all of his reports to the Justice Department, hundreds of pages, which, as I say, you can look at in the National Archives, there are no fervent expressions of patriotism. I think he just enjoyed playing a role, pretending to be somebody he wasn't, and having a secret that nobody around him knew. That's my speculation. He eventually got outed half a dozen years after this period, and a labor newspaper discovered who he was and published an expose. And then he had a later career as a private detective, running a private detective agency in Detroit, and became a lieutenant colonel in the Michigan State Troops, which were the ancestor of the Michigan National Guard.
This is a time of radical politics, not just in Washington, D.C., but outside Washington, D.C. This is a time where Wobblies obviously were considered a threat. You had the Bolshevik Revolution that was happening in Russia at the time. You had Emma Goldman running around the United States around this period of time. Talk to me about the left in America during World War I.
Well, up until the beginning of the war, the left had been tremendously optimistic. Up until 1914, it had been a time when many people were confident that, all over the world, socialist parties were growing. In many countries, from the United States to Germany, legislatures passed the beginnings of social welfare measures, trying to stay ahead of the socialists. Thinking, well, maybe we can steal a march on them if we put in a strong child labor law, something like that. Then, of course, the war was a tremendous disappointment and disillusionment for people with the left everywhere, because they saw how readily millions of people all over the world reverted to feeling their prime loyalty was to their country and not to their cause. The left in the U.S. didn't suffer quite as badly because the United States still stayed out of the war. But come 1917, the U.S. joined the war, and then the government viciously did everything it could to crush the left. The Wobblies, for example, were, the most visible union in the United States. They never comprised more than about 5% of unionized American workers, but they had the best music, they had the best songs, they had the most colorful people, and they were kind of the militant edge of the labor movement. And in the fall of 1917, a couple months after the U.S. entered the war, the government did a sweeping set of raids all around the country, rounding up hundreds and hundreds of Wobblies and put them behind bars. In early 1918, more than 90 of them were found guilty in a single trial in Chicago and sent to prison for collectively a total of more than 800 years if you add up all the sentences given to the group. So that movement was in essence crushed. The Socialist Party was in essence crushed. The Wilson administration got very alarmed when the socialists made strong gains in municipal elections in the fall of 1917, a couple months after the U.S. entered the war. the socialists got more than 20% of the vote in 14 of the country's larger cities, and more than 30% of the vote in several of them, 22% of the vote in New York, for example. And Wilson was horrified because his Democrats controlled the House of Representatives only by a very, very slim margin. And the thought that an anti-war party might gain the balance of power in the midterm elections of 1918 was horrifying to him. And you can find worried correspondence between him and his attorney general and other people. What can we do? Well, what they did was to find excuses to one after another arrest leading socialists and put them in jail. By a year or so later, there were enough socialist state party chairs, former candidates for the House and Senate and governor in federal prisons around the country that if you had them all in one spot, you could have had a small party Congress. The most famous of those people, of course, was Eugene Debs, who would then run for president 4 times on the socialist ticket. A very gentle, charismatic, warm man, devout Christian, committed to nonviolence, committed to working within the electoral system. He was arrested in 1918, sentenced to 10 years in prison for speaking out against the war in a fairly mild and vague way. But nonetheless, it was enough to put him behind bars where the government wanted him. And in 1920, he was still in prison when he received more than 900,000 votes on the socialist ticket running for president. 2 years later, the war hysteria had abated. Wilson was no longer in office. Warren Harding was president, and he remitted Debs' sentence, let him out of prison, and invited him to stop in at the White House on his way home. So the two of them had a half-hour chat. We don't know exactly what was said. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that conversation. And Debs joked to reporters that he had run for the White House 5 times, but this was the first time he'd actually gotten there. Harding did just reduce his sentence to time served, but didn't fully pardon him, which meant that Debs didn't have his citizenship rights restored, such as the right to vote. And a reporter asked him after this visit to the White House, "How do you feel about that, Mr. Debs?" And Debs said, "Well, now I am only a citizen of the world." And I think that's what we should all feel.
Speaking of Eugene Victor Debs, Woodrow Wilson refused to pardon him. Now, Woodrow Wilson was struck by a stroke and was debilitated towards the end of his presidency. But it is interesting to be having this conversation about this period of time and thinking about Woodrow Wilson, who, yes, was also an adamant racist, but was also someone that you described as maybe perhaps our last progressive president from a progressive era.
That's true. Wilson, we speak of the progressive era in this country, usually vaguely meaning, the time from 1900 or so up to maybe 1915 or 16, when, some basic progressive legislation was passed, child labor laws, the beginning of tougher regulations on business, some antitrust laws, other things like that. And Woodrow Wilson was, known as a progressive and was elected on that kind of platform in 1912. To me, an interesting thing about Wilson, whom I certainly got to know better, so to speak, in the course of doing this book, is it's just a reminder that demagoguery doesn't always come in the form of a blusterer like Donald Trump. Wilson was the most scholarly of American presidents. He was the author of more than a dozen books. He'd been a college professor most of his life. He was president of Princeton University for 10 years. He knew all kinds of writers and intellectuals. He was very soft-spoken. But he still presided over what I think was the greatest constriction of American civil liberties since the end of slavery. And all of the things that made this period so, uh, so shattering, the jailing of these radicals. This was a time when more than 1,000 Americans went to jail for a year or more, and a much larger number for shorter periods, solely for things that they wrote or said. It was a period of press censorship. It was a period when unions were crushed. And Wilson knew all this and orchestrated a lot of it with his professorial style. So someone doing this stuff doesn't always have to look like Donald Trump.
Is this the threat to democracy that you're talking about in the book, American
Oh,
Midnight?
absolutely. I mean, when you put together these things, the jailing of people for their political opinions, the vast expansion of government surveillance, some of it done by the military, some of it done by the Department of Justice, press censorship on a large scale, and a deliberate encouragement of vigilante violence. 250,000 Americans belonged to an organization called the American Protective League, which was chartered by the Department of Justice. They joined Department of Justice agents on raids against radicals. They made citizens arrests by the tens of thousands of young men who they suspected of avoiding the draft. They took part in vigilante violence, which they described sometimes with great zest. And all of this stuff was happening with government approval under the Wilson administration.
Is this neighbor going after neighbor?
Very often, yes, because these divisions ran through communities. It was not really a regional thing at all.
Tell me about A. Mitchell Palmer, Attorney General during this time. And you referenced a number of raids and arrests. Is this what was known as Palmer's raids?
Some of them were. Mitchell Palmer was a very ambitious politician. He'd been a Pennsylvania congressman. And he became Wilson's Attorney General towards in the middle of Wilson's second term. And Palmer saw his way to the presidential nomination in 1920. He was very ambitious to become the Democratic candidate for president, and for quite a while, many months, was actually leading the pack. He wanted to run as a law and order candidate. He was, after all, the country's chief law enforcement officer as Attorney General. And he saw the mood of the time was to crush radicals. And in fact, there was some violence that came from the left during this period. In 1919, there were a series of bombings around the country done by a small group of Italian anarchists, the Gallianists, probably no more than 50 in the country as a whole. They were never caught, but today it's believed they were the people who carried out the bombings, one of which was at Palmer's own house. But the government blamed these on the Bolsheviks, the socialists, the left, the IWW, the people that they were anxious to prosecute. So Palmer saw his path to the Democratic nomination as being the law and order candidate. And the Palmer raids were a series of raids around the country, late 1919 and early 1920, which altogether rounded up about 10,000 people who were interrogated, often roughed up, and several thousand of them were kept in prison, jailed, because the government saw them as candidates for deportation. These were people who were foreign born and for one reason or another had never officially become naturalized as American citizens. It was something many people thought not necessary to do at a time when the country seemed to be welcoming immigrants, or they had trouble with the English language and didn't want to go through with the bureaucracy. So thousands of these folks were in prison, scheduled for deportation. Palmer very loudly and publicly deported a whole shipload of them in late 1917. Emma Goldman and her comrade Alexander Berkman were on that ship. And he loudly promised an audience in New York that there would be ship after ship carrying more dangerous radicals out of the country, sailing down the harbor in the near future. That plan got foiled by a very clever bureaucrat named Louis F. Post, who was acting Secretary of Labor. The Justice Department could arrest people, but expulsions, deportations came under the Labor Department because it had the Immigration Bureau. Post was a progressive who had sort of become Secretary of Labor by accident. He was the third ranking person in the department, and the secretary was on leave. The second ranking person left unexpectedly, and Post found himself for about a period of about 6 weeks acting Secretary of Labor, during which time he found legal and bureaucratic means to invalidate thousands of deportation warrants, which made Palmer absolutely furious, as it also infuriated Palmer's deputy, J. Edgar Hoover, who was somebody the country would come to know much better in the next 50 years. But they never really succeeded in getting their mass deportations underway.
Is there more you could tell me about the Galeanes, these anarchists, and isn't this where we get the term propaganda of the deed?
Yeah, that was, I mean, the anarchist movement was a sort of nebulous one. There were many people who considered themselves anarchists then and who still do today who do not believe in violence. But this small group who were followers of a guy named Galeano believed that, you know, if there were explosions, if there were assassinations, somehow the great masses would be galvanized into action by the sight of somebody actually going ahead and killing a high government official. Turned out not to be true, of course. But these explosions, for example, the night that Palmer's house was blown up, there were 8 simultaneous explosions in other cities. And this greatly alarmed the country and made people feel, you know, there's some sort of violent conspiracy out there. And Palmer twisted all that rage to focus it on the people that he was eager to prosecute, the Wobblies, the socialists, other leftists. They never succeeded in definitively nailing the Galeanists.
Can be argued that the seeds of fascism are planted here at the end of World War I. Mussolini and Hitler were both veterans of World War I. Many World War I veterans coming home feeling disaffected about what happened with the war. We even had that, I think, in the early 1930s in the United States with the bonus army that Herbert Hoover violently attacked. I think what stopped maybe fascism from spreading more here in the United States was that the 1932 election of FDR, and then FDR and Eleanor's Roosevelt's response to the bonus army afterwards. Is that important to know in this story that you tell, in this threat to democracy?
Well, the story I've told in American Midnight pretty much comes to an end a couple of years after the First World War. There certainly is another chapter which carries us into the 1930s, when I think, as you say, we were very lucky that it was Franklin Roosevelt who was elected in 1932. I mean, imagine if the country in that dire straits in the Depression had been in the hands of somebody like Donald Trump or any number of other demagogues who would have blamed for the Depression, you know, Jews or black people or immigrants or any of the many kinds of targets that demagogues like to find. We would have had a very different 1930s.
We hear a lot about threats to democracy today. How do you compare and contrast what you're observing today in the newspapers compared to this history that you write about in World War I?
Well, obviously, you know, democracy is under great threat today. You know, January 6th of last year, we had a violent mob invade the capital of the United States, come within a hair's breadth of, you know, carrying off senators, congressmen, using that gallows they'd erected in front of the Capitol. Who knows what could have happened? Uh, we have threats of that sort. We have threats of, Republicans running for office promising to take control of the election machinery and implicitly promising who is going to win elections in the future. Those are the kinds of threats we face today. There are many others as well. I think why I wanted to write about this period of the U.S. just over 100 years ago to show that threats to democracy are nothing new. They're always there. We have to be very vigilant about it, and we have to better understand times like that period from 1917 to 1921, when in many ways democracy partly disappeared in this country. What were the sources of the frenzy? That fear of the Russian Revolution, the patriotic hysteria kicked off by the First World War. We have to be alert for things like that might happen in the future.
Did the threat to democracy, in your view, abate, lessen in the years following the end of World War I? What happened?
I think that the hysteria that I was talking about did die down after 1920 or so. In fact, there's sort of a moment that's a key turning point. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, whom we were talking about, was running hard for the Democratic 1920 presidential nomination. And he repeatedly said that on May 1st, May Day, the left-wing holiday, 1920, there was going to be a nationwide communist uprising. And all over the country, Bureau of Investigation agents were on guard in force. The National Guard was on standby. J.P. Morgan hired extra security men. The New York police force called in all three shifts. So one shift was on the streets and the other were waiting in station houses. And Palmer had promised this is going to be the day when the communists try to take over. Nothing happened. And it kind of took the wind out of Palmer's presidential campaign. He did not get the nomination. And from that point on, you can really see the hysteria abating. However, it had a lot of casualties. It really crushed the left. It crushed the labor movement. Even the very moderate American Federation of Labor lost 1 million members in this period. The labor movement really didn't come back to life in a big way until the 1930s. It wasn't until 1924 that the last political prisoner was released from a federal prison. So, yes, we got past it, but at a big cost.
You did pique my interest earlier when you said in the years immediately following the war, people look back at it as a mistake. That hasn't really been the case in my lifetime. I mean, of course, there are some who will look at it as a mistake, but it's oftentimes seen now as another good war, that it was good for the United States to get in. Tell me about people looking back early on to this war and seeing it as a mistake.
I think really all over the world in the 1920s, there was a recognition that this war had made the world worse in every conceivable way. It obviously left behind a deeply embittered Germany, and Hitler made use of that bitterness to come to power. It savaged the economies of the countries that had been principally involved in it, England, France, Italy, Russia. It spurred the Russian Revolution, which was something many people had great hopes for at the beginning, but soon turned into a horror show. And I think even in the United States, which had economically prospered from the war and had not lost anywhere near as many soldiers as Europe had, there was a recognition that it may have been a mistake. President Harding said off the record at one point before he let Debs out of jail, he said off the record, and it was only reported after his death, we made a mistake of getting into that war. Debs was right. And many politicians said this, although it wasn't many politicians felt this way, although it wasn't very politic to say so because it implied that no longer wanted to honor war veterans.
Do you think it got a sort of a reevaluation come World War II? I was guessing here when it suddenly is not seen as such a mistake.
Well, I think World War II was sort of a different animal in a way because there the United States actually was attacked at Pearl Harbor. And Hitler's Germany was a very different thing from the Kaiser's Germany. And there are people, both left and right. For example, the British historian Niall Ferguson, who's very much a right-winger, he was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher, argues that it was a tremendous mistake for Britain to join World War I. Because so what if Germany had conquered all of Europe? What the Germans really wanted, he felt, was a sort of economic federation of European countries which they could dominate, and that's exactly what the European Union is today. So that argument still goes on. There are other people in Britain who say, no, it was right for Britain to fight in the war. But the war did leave pretty awful consequences on all sides.
Adam Hochschild, thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. It's always a pleasure talking.
Adam Hochschild has been our guest. Again, he is the author of the book, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis.